Doorbells at Dusk. Edited by Evans Light. Associate editors are Gregor Xane, Jason Parent, Adam Light. A Plague of Monsters by Charles A. Gramlich. Gus Krebs gnawed at his thumb while looking down at the unconscious monster strapped to the work table in his basement. He didn't know what it was, but it looked piggish. Nor did he have any idea where it came from. He'd been watching Wheel of Fortune when his doorbell rang. He'd just solved a puzzle before the actual contestants, and the thrill of that unusual occurrence made him forget normal caution. Carelessly opening the door had revealed this thing standing there. It carried a small glowing axe, and at sight of the weapon, Gus reflexively punched it twice. It went down easily, maybe because it was small, and he dragged it into the house before any of the neighbors noticed. Because he often used power drills and saws while building furniture at home, his basement was soundproofed. Even if this thing woke up now and screamed, it wouldn't be heard. Gus picked up the creature's axe. It appeared to be made out of some hard plastic, like a toy, but Gus figured it wasn't any toy. The light inside had gone out when its owner lost consciousness. Maybe it was some kind of mind-controlled laser. Would the little monster still be able to activate the weapon when it woke up and found itself a prisoner? Gus had to take precautions, do something, fast. He grabbed a hammer from his tool chest and smashed the weird weapon into smithereens, then threw its mangled remains into the trash can. Needing a moment to think, Gus went back upstairs and poured himself a cup of coffee with a dollop of whiskey to calm his nerves. The burnt scent of the coffee reminded him of his long-dead daddy, and immediately the odor started to soothe him. He was blowing on the coffee to cool it when the doorbell rang again. He jumped, spilling blistering liquid down his chin onto his shirt. Cursing, he set down the cup and grabbed a towel to mop himself. The doorbell rang twice more, and its incessant demands forced him out of his kitchen into the living room. He crossed to the door and peeked out through the spy hole. Nothing. Taking up the baseball bat he always kept handy against potential intruders, he cautiously unlatched his door and opened it. Two monsters waited outside. They were smaller than the first, but they also had laser weapons. These even looked like sci-fi blasters, and they whined as they lit up. In a panic, Gus bashed both creatures over the head with his bat and quickly dragged them inside. As he slammed his door, he realized his front porch light was on and wondered if it were attracting these grotesque things. Maybe they were like moths that way. He flicked off the light and double-locked the doors, then hauled the two monsters down into the basement. Neither of them appeared to be breathing, but he bound them to stout chairs anyway. Once more he returned to his kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee. Pacing and sipping, he tried to figure out what was happening. Finally, he went to the front of the house and eased back the window curtains to look outside. He quickly slapped a hand over his mouth to keep from crying out. The sidewalk along the road that ran past his house had become a monster freeway. Dozens of the horrible creatures scampered along beneath the streetlights, with normal people intermingled among them. He saw attractive Mrs. Broussard from next door and Mr. Demby from down on the corner. Two small monsters tugged at Demby's hands as they urged him along. Demby laughed as if it were glorious fun. Gus backed away from the window, then quickly opened the closet and took out the shotgun he'd bought a few years back for home defense. He'd never had to use it, but that might soon change. Fumbling around on the closet shelf, he found the shells and began pushing them into the gun's magazine. The doorbell rang. Gus jumped and almost pulled the trigger on the shotgun. He moved cautiously to the door, weapon ready, and peered out through the spy hole. 2 police officers, a man and a woman, stood outside. He breathed a sigh of relief. Just a second, he called. Hang on. Sticking the shotgun back in the closet behind some coats, he returned to open the door. As he was about to warn the officers about the monsters, he noted that plenty of the nasty creatures still wandered along the street. The police didn't seem to notice or care. That scared him. Yes, Gus asked warily. Mr. Krebs, the policewoman said. I'm Officer Benton, and this is my partner, Officer Reynolds. Sorry to bother you, but we've had a report of a missing child. Corey Olson. We were wondering if you'd seen him? If he'd been here trick or treating. He was dressed as an orc. Gus had no idea what an orc was, but he wanted to shout, well, of course you've got missing children. You've got a town full of monsters. What do you expect? Then something else Officer Benton had said registered. Gus repeated the phrase, trick or treating. But it's not Halloween. No, the woman said. But you knew the town council voted to change the date this year, right? Because of the big parade to honor our returning veterans? They're coming back on the 31st. Can't have that and Halloween on the same day. She smiled. Gus's mind did a backflip inside his head. Did that mean that could he have made a horrible mistake in identifying the monsters? Were they just? No, he wasn't crazy. He knew what he'd seen. And even though he never celebrated Halloween, there'd been no vote that he was aware of to change the date. The police were lying. In the next instant, he figured out why. Whoever or whatever was behind this monster plague must have planned it for Halloween, the perfect cover. But something had gone wrong. Things had started too soon, and the forces behind it were scrambling for excuses. Anyway, he knew to keep such doubts and questions to himself. If they could lie, he could lie. Well, yeah. I completely forgot to get candy because of the date change. So I've just been leaving my porch light off. The Olsen kid, you say? I'll certainly keep an eye open for him, but I doubt I'll see him. I'll call you guys if I do. The female officer, Benton, was smiling, but her male partner, Reynolds, was busy looking over Gus's head into the house. Gus didn't like that. What if they wanted to come inside? Even if they didn't check the basement, the baseball bat was still behind the door. He hadn't cleaned it after knocking out the last 2 monsters. Did it have blood on it? Other stuff? He started to take a deep breath to calm himself, but thinking that might be suspicious, he quickly turned it into a cough. Reynolds frowned. Benton kept smiling and said, "Do keep an eye out. I imagine he's just off somewhere binging on Halloween candy. But his parents are pretty worried." "I will. Certainly I will, officers." Gus forced a smile of his own. The officers turned away and Gus shut and locked the door behind him. He grabbed up the bat, which was discolored around the tip with what might be drying blood. He rushed downstairs with it. Once in the basement, Gus paced back and forth, muttering to himself. The police. They didn't care about the monsters on the street. So maybe they're monsters. Or at least they're following the orders of the monsters. That means they aren't looking for Corey Olsen. They're looking for... Biting his lip, Gus turned toward the 3 creatures he'd captured. Looking for them, he thought. He had to do something, get rid of the things before the police came back and looked harder. He strode over to the first monster he'd captured and stared down with revulsion. The thing began thrashing back and forth on the table. Gus let out a little scream and jumped back. But he still had the baseball bat in his hands, and he began whacking until the thing went still again. A lot more blood coated the bat this time. Then Gus noticed something else. My God, he muttered. The monster's face had sloughed to the side as Gus hammered at it. Beneath the hideous piggishness was a second face, one he recognized. Little Corey Olsen. Can't be. No, I couldn't have killed. His thoughts stopped for a moment as he studied the remains of the thing. He saw it then, enough to convince him that he wasn't crazy. His thoughts restarted. No. It's growing another Corey Olsen inside. A false Corey Olsen. I see parts that aren't human. The other 2 monsters I've got down here must be like this one. But the adults, the parents, are they the same? Already molted maybe? Gus dropped the bat with a clang and backed away from the horror on the table. He kept backing until his legs struck something behind him. Startled, Gus spun around to see nothing more than his bandsaw squatting in its accustomed place. The solution to his problem shouted at him. He rushed upstairs to fetch towels and a bunch of black trash bags. Then he set to work cutting the 3 monsters into pieces and fitting them into the bags, which he tied off tightly and wrapped with strips of electrical tape. The bandsaw was frightfully efficient. Within an hour, Gus finished his chore. The basement had a sink with running water, and another hour saw the blood and gore cleaned away and the stuffed bags tucked into the darkest corner of the room. Gus pushed his bloody clothes into yet another bag, then went upstairs to take a hot shower. After exiting the shower, he wiped away the condensation on the bathroom mirror to study himself in it. His reflection tore a gasp from him. His face, it was subtly altered. Not dramatically. Not yet at least. But he could see the differences. The blood, he thought. I had on clothes and gloves, but it got on my face. I'm starting to change. It must be like an infection. It grows on the skin. First it takes you over, controls you. Then another you hatches out from within. Not the real one, though. A modified one. One of them. Quickly and in desperation, using cotton balls and rubbing alcohol, Gus began to scrub at his face. He scrubbed and scrubbed, until his skin burned and tingled, until the fumes from the alcohol watered his eyes and made him feel faint. Only when his face was, as his daddy had always described it, pink as a freshly spanked bottom, did he quit. Maybe, he thought. Maybe I've stopped it. I hope I've stopped it. The doorbell rang once, then again. Gus wanted to ignore the sound. He wanted to get into bed and bury himself under the covers until the world was shut out. But the bell rang a third time, and a fourth. He finally shouted out, "I'm coming." Through the peephole, Gus saw the same two cops again. He thought about the bat, cleaned but forgotten in the basement. He thought of the shotgun in the closet. He dared not use it. If he did, the whole street, the whole town, would be on him in an instant. He'd have to bluff them again, then run as soon as they were gone. Surely there was another town he could escape to. The monsters couldn't have taken over everywhere yet. Forcing himself to breathe steadily, he slowly opened the door. "Hello again, officers," he said. "Sorry it took me so long. I just got out of the shower." They could see his wet hair. They'd know he was telling the truth. The policeman, Reynolds, still looked suspicious, and now the policewoman, Benton, was no longer smiling. "Mr. Krebs," Benton said, "I'm afraid we've had 2 more children reported missing. We've been instructed to go from house to house doing a search. Is it okay for us to come in and look around?" Well, you don't think that It's not a matter of thinking anything, Mr. Krebs," Benton interrupted. "The whole police force is out. It's just our job to search every place where children might hide." Her eyes seemed to glitter. "Or where they might be held." "Well, okay. Of course. I want to do my part. Come on in. You won't find anything here, though." Gus stepped back from the door to allow the 2 in. They quickly split up and began their search. Reynolds took the upstairs. Benton stayed downstairs to inspect the living room, kitchen, and laundry room. Gus trailed her, staying far enough away to avoid giving any impression of a threat. There came a heart-stopping moment when the policewoman opened the closet and shoved things around. But if she saw the shotgun leaning against the back wall in the shadows, she said nothing. Of course, lots of folks had guns in Coleman, Louisiana. Gus hoped the woman wouldn't even think of the basement. Few houses down here had them because of the danger of flooding. But this woman was thorough and eventually asked him point blank if he had one. He couldn't lie. How could he be sure she hadn't already noticed the obscure door and was just testing him? He pointed out the bamboo screen he used to cover the ugly, unpainted door into the basement, opened it, flipped on the light, and went down the steps ahead of her. His eyes were wide as he scanned for any droplet of blood or unusual stain he might have missed. Everything looked clean. He could see the trash bags with the severed monster parts in them against the back wall, but nothing indicated that they were filled with anything other than common trash. Benton looked around rather perfunctorily. "Lot of equipment," she said. "Yes. I make furniture sometimes. You can ask anyone." She nodded, then shrugged. "All right. Nothing here." She looked at Gus. "We'll get out of your hair, Mr. Krebs." "Sorry I couldn't be more help," Gus said, as the policewoman turned toward the stairs. "Wish I could." A rustling came from the corner of the basement where the trash bag sat. Gus spun around in time to see what looked like a leg kick at the black plastic of the bag that wrapped it. He quickly moved in that direction as the woman turned toward him with a frown. "Damn rats," Gus said. "Can't keep them out of here. Don't know how they're getting in." He pretended to look around by the bags, as if searching for a rat, then returned his gaze to Officer Benton. She was watching him and he smiled. She smiled back. "I know the problem. We've got them down at the precinct, too." She went up the stairs then, and Gus followed after giving the offending trash bag a surreptitious kick. Officer Reynolds awaited them in the living room. "Nothing," he said, sounding disappointed. "All right," Benton said. "Let's get out of here." Gus felt a smile coming on and fought it down. As he closed the door behind the officers, a fresh banging came from the basement. Gus's smile disappeared, and he quickly glanced out through the peephole to see if the police had heard the noise. Reynolds had stopped to look back at the house with a frown, but Benton was already striding down the sidewalk. After another moment, the policeman followed his partner. Gus continued to watch, and was glad he did as Reynolds stopped at the end of the driveway and several other people joined him. Gus's eyes widened as he recognized Jim and Kathy Olson, Corey Olson's parents. There was another woman with them that Gus didn't know, and another couple that he did, Dwayne and Tina Lamont. Dwayne was a district attorney. Tina was a real estate agent. She'd tried several times to get him to sell his house, but it had belonged to Gus's daddy. The Lamonts had a boy a year or so younger than Corey Olson. Gus had met him, Terry. As Reynolds stood in deep conversation with the other 5 people, Gus wondered if one of the monsters he'd killed could have been growing into Terry Lamont. He was mulling that over when Reynolds and the others turned suddenly to look toward Gus's front door. Gus jumped back from the peephole, afraid they were reading his thoughts. Who knew what powers these things had? "They're on to me. They know I know. That means they'll be coming. I've got to get out of here. Quick." Possible escape routes suggested themselves and were discarded. He couldn't go out the front way. They'd be watching even if they didn't seem to be. And the back was no good. He'd put an 8-foot privacy fence around his backyard to keep out the kids and to make sure no nosy neighbors could look in on him. That fence had no gate, and he'd have to use a ladder to get over it. Too much noise. There was one other way. When this house had first been built, there'd been a coal-fired furnace in the basement. Gus had long since converted to electric heat and removed the furnace. But the door to the coal chute was still there. He'd bolted it shut, but had the tools to open it. He'd have to leave with nothing but what he could stuff into a gym bag and with the money he had in the house. Fortunately, he'd never trusted banks, so a cubbyhole in his basement wall hid most of his slender fortune, enough to take him a long way from here. Rushing upstairs, he grabbed a gym bag he hadn't used for years and stuffed it with a toothbrush, a couple of changes of underwear, some shirts and socks, and a pair of jeans. It was little enough for the 40-plus years he'd spent in this house. But he'd never married or had kids. He had no keepsake photos and had never attached himself to material objects other than the house itself. He was glad of that now. After taking a last pee, he headed downstairs. A glance through the peephole in his front door showed a nearly empty street. Nearly everyone was probably taken over by now. If any real people remained in the houses along the road or in the town, it didn't matter. He couldn't risk trying to identify any humans who were left. He had to save himself. And For a moment, he couldn't capture the thought he wanted. It finally came to him. Warn the rest of the world. With his mind a jumble, Gus opened the basement door, then paused. The lights were on. He could have sworn he'd turned them off. Was he getting forgetful as well as confused? Losing it, he muttered to himself. Had to be the stress, he imagined. He started down the steps, froze at the bottom. The coal chute door. He'd planned to unbolt it and sneak out that way. It already hung open. Impossible. The scrape of shoes on concrete sounded behind Gus, and he spun around. The policewoman, Benton, stepped out from the shadows beneath the basement stairs. A lit flashlight filled one of her badly trembling hands. The other held her service revolver, which pointed generally in Gus's direction. Vomit splattered the front of the woman's blue uniform shirt. "My God, Krebs," she muttered. "My God." Gus chewed at his lip. He looked over to where he'd stacked the trash bags full of body parts. They'd been torn open. A small arm hung from one, blackish blood dribbling down the ghastly gray fingers. Gus looked back at Benton. He held up his hands, spread them. "You don't understand," he said. "I know what this must look like. But those things aren't human." Benton retched, wiped her mouth on the back of the hand that held the flashlight. Her bloodshot gaze locked on his. Her lower lip quivered, then stiffened. "I know," she said. "I saw them. Some parts. I don't know what they are. And then, sometimes pieces move. They should be dead, but they move. My God, what are they?" Gus swayed as he heard her words. Relief almost made him pass out. "Monsters," he finally answered. "I don't know what else to call them. Monsters. Yes, monsters. How many? Are there more? Do you think?" "A whole lot more, I bet," Gus said. "I'm sure the parents of these three things are. Maybe most of the people in town, judging from how many were on the streets earlier." "I thought you were. And your partner." "Reynolds," Benton said. "I think you're right about him. He's been weird." Gus strained to focus his thoughts. His head buzzed. His bones seemed to rattle inside his body. "We've got to get out of here," he finally managed. "That's why I came down here. I've got money. Hidden. I was going to slip out the coal chute. You can go with me." The woman wiped her mouth again, then slowly straightened as her training reasserted itself. "Yes, we'll get out, but not through the coal chute. I told my partner I'd noticed something odd in your basement before when you mentioned rats. I pried open the chute to slip in. He's outside, waiting. He won't wait long." "We can't go out the front door," Gus said. "We can. We'll have to. I'll take you to my cruiser. Put you in the back like I'm taking you to headquarters for questioning. Then we'll just leave town. Find somebody to report this thing to." She stared at him hard for a moment. "I'll need to put you in cuffs. Temporarily. To make it look good." Gus's heart pounded. He didn't want to be in cuffs. If the things came for him, he'd be helpless. But he couldn't think. He had to trust Officer Benton. Or give up, the thought came. Let them have me. He shook his head in negation of that thought. "Okay, just let me get my money." Benton nodded as she moved toward the stairs. Hurry! A hidden catch in the back wall of the basement opened a small cubby. Inside were stacks of bills and rolls of quarters, dimes, and nickels. Leaving the coins, Gus scraped the bills off into his gym bag and returned to Officer Benton. She led the way up into the house, and they hurried to the front door. Benton flipped the latch and had just started to turn the knob when the door thrust open and Reynolds fueled his way through. He held a baton, and as he swung it brutally toward Benton, the woman shoved her pistol into her one-time partner's chest and pulled the trigger twice. The nightstick struck Benton's left shoulder, and her sharp cry of pain was louder than the reports of the shots muffled by Reynolds' body. Reynolds lost control of the baton as he stiffened from the shock of the bullets. His eyes blinked. Then he grabbed his chest and slid slowly to the floor. Benton leaned over him, pressed the fingers of her gun hand against his throat. She looked up at Gus, shook her head. He nodded. "Stay here," Benton said. "We'll have to do it differently now." She picked up Reynolds' cap where it had fallen and handed it to Gus. "Put that on. Your shirt's dark already. I'll get the car. Drive right up to your house. Hop in fast. Try not to let anyone get a good look at you." Again, Gus nodded. Benton holstered her pistol and went out through the door, favoring her injured arm where the baton had struck. Gus stepped forward, pushed the door but didn't latch it. He heard a squishing sound and looked down. Blood from the dead policeman soaked the carpet. Tendrils of it had spackled his shoes and seemed to writhe even as he stepped back from the body and began wiping his feet off on the rug. Nauseated and repulsed, Gus backed farther from the body. The blood seemed to follow him, swirling into crimson patterns that almost had meaning. The buzzing in his head had grown louder. His eyes throbbed in their sockets. Something made him step around the blood and kneel beside the dead officer. He unsnapped the strap that held the manservice revolver in its holster and tucked the gun into his gym bag among the piles of cash. Almost as an afterthought, he added the policeman's taser as well. Then his thoughts cleared. He rose again and waited for his ride. When Gus heard the police cruiser pull up outside, he rushed out. Benton had the passenger side door open and he dove in. She immediately threw the cruiser into reverse and squealed out onto the highway. "Slouch down," she said. "If we're lucky, they'll think you're Reynolds." Gus noticed that Benton still wasn't using her left arm much, but it didn't seem to hurt her driving. "How are we leaving town?" he asked. "Highway 23. It's the fastest route to the I-12. Plus, it's just past headquarters, so it'll look normal for us to head in that direction." "What happens once we pass headquarters?" Benton glanced over at him. "We run for it." Gus nodded. "Then, this thing with the monsters. It's some kind of infection. Pass through bodily fluids, like blood. It makes me wonder." "Wonder what?" Benton asked. "Wonder how you weren't taken over?" "I figured they go after the police first." Benton frowned at his comment, then gave a small gasp. "Bodily fluids. Or maybe food contaminated with such fluids. A few days ago, one of the officers brought in some cookies. I ate some. I think everyone did. That night I got very sick. Headaches. nausea. I thought I was dying, but it passed quickly. I thought it had to be the cookies. Food poisoning. But the next day, none of the other officers admitted being sick. They'd been changed, Gus said. Yes, Benton nodded. But it didn't take with me. For some reason. She glanced again at Gus. Maybe I'm immune. Maybe you are too. Maybe Gus agreed. They passed Coleman's police station and turned onto Highway 23. A half-mile down, they'd find the on-ramp for the I-12. From there, they could get to New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Jackson. It wasn't going to be that easy, though. Benton slammed on the brakes as she saw what stretched across 23 ahead of them. A double-thick line of people covered the road behind a barricade of sawhorses and yellow police tape. Most had guns, though some held axes and hoes and other garden implements. As the police cruiser rolled to a stop, the crowd began filtering through the barricades and moving toward the car. There were men, women, and some kids still in their Halloween costumes, though Gus figured none of them were really men, women, or kids anymore. Then Gus became aware of a low, moaning sound arising from the crowd. It stirred him in his seat. "They know," he said. "It's no use. We better give up." Benton shook her head. "No. Brace yourself. We'll ram through." Gus watched the policewoman wince with pain as she forced her left arm up to grasp the steering wheel. She revved the engine, but let off the gas when he pressed the pistol he'd taken from Reynolds against her neck. "Don't make me shoot you," he said. Benton turned her head very slowly. "What are you doing?" she protested. "You're not one of them. You killed those 3 monsters at your house. You're human." "I know you are." The crowd was close now, close and watching. In another moment, the police cruiser would be completely surrounded. Gus shook his head at Benton, then opened his mouth and began to moan in synchrony with the approaching monsters. Benton slapped at Gus's pistol with one hand while her foot smashed down on the accelerator. Gus had been expecting the attempt, and he shot her with the taser in his other hand. She cried out, wilting over the steering wheel. The car lurched forward, then stalled and died. The crowd's keening fell silent as they reached the car. Half a dozen tore open the driver's side door of the vehicle and pulled out Benton. She moaned at first, then began to thrash, and finally to scream. Gus waited until they'd dragged the policewoman off into the darkness. Then he got out of the car as well. The crowd began to disperse, except for the children who'd completed their metamorphosis. Those began climbing up on the car or onto anything else that would get them off the ground. Gus recognized several of them as kids he'd seen around his neighborhood. They looked almost exactly as they had when they'd been human, except for the dragonfly wings. One by one, as Gus watched, the younglings spread their wings and took to the sky in a hum. Some flew south, others north, east, west. Gus thought of the towns they'd soon visit. Covington, Abita Springs, Hammond, Slidell, New Orleans. He thought of the new swarms that would soon be raised. And he wondered, how long could he pass for a monster